to this July third Thursday Lunch and Learn webinar. We run these every third Thursday, as the name implies, and so I'm glad you could be with us today. My name is Marla Phillips, and I am the Director of Xavier Health. The goal of these Lunch and Learn sessions is to advance your awareness on topics that you might not normally be talking about or have exposure to. And in some cases, you've come across these types of topics throughout your career, and it can take a career to gain this kind of insight. So we're basically trying to increase your awareness on factors that can help influence what you do every day and how you can see your organization is being influenced by outside factors, again, that you might not normally be thinking about or be exposed to. For those of you who are not as familiar with us, I would like to share with you what our mission is. So at Xavier Health, our mission is inspiring collaboration, leading innovation, and making a difference. And ways that we do that are shown on this next slide, where it has lists of the conferences that we run, initiatives that we're leading, and development opportunities. And you can see in green the Xavier Third Thursday Lunch and Learn series, because that's obviously what we're doing right now. But we do have our FDA co-sponsored pharma and medical device conferences listed at the top. And we have a brand new summit for artificial intelligence that is occurring August 24th and 25th that will apply across quality, regulatory, and supply chain. So we hope to see you there. We have our combination product summit that is not FDA co-sponsored, but the FDA director of that office is on our committee, so they are very involved. And we were actually asked if we could start a cybersecurity summit to get down into the how-tos of a lot of cybersecurity challenges. As far as initiatives, we launched the Center for Artificial Intelligence, and the work that we're going to do is going to come through the summit itself. We're going to develop working teams that come out of that. We have our Supply by Design initiative that cuts across pharma and device. We have a last mile initiative where we're looking at what happens to your product after it leaves the distributors and makes its way to the pharmacies at the hospitals or elsewhere. We are in the process of developing an East Coast Xavier Health chapter and a Cincinnati Xavier Health chapter. And in addition to the Lunch and Learn series, we have an on-demand device training toolbox, and we are in the process of strategizing a one-day web conference with regulators. So in essence, we have over 150 pharmaceutical professionals, medical device professionals, and FDA officials formally engaged with us in any number of the things that we're doing at any given time. So we're glad that you could be with us today, and I hope to see that you can maybe get engaged with us in more ways as well. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker for today. Jason Barkeloo is the chairman and founder of Opentherapeutics. As a serial entrepreneur, his motto is, "It's not why we can't, it's how we can." So Jason has a strong reputation for building sound businesses and transitioning them to professional management. Having transitioned Opentherapeutics to a professional management team, Jason continues to remain involved from a strategic perspective. His two enterprises prior to Opentherapeutics were Pilot Energy, a synthetic bacterial-based platform, which he sold to a reputable company, and Somatic Digital, a human-computer interface company that developed the touch user interface. So welcome, Jason, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today to share with us some insight on the concept and impact of Opentherapeutics.
Pleasure to be with you, Marla.
Okay, great. So with that, I'll go ahead and just do an interview with Jason, and we'll have an opportunity to hear his response on several questions. And the first one is, Jason, can you describe how the current state of drug discovery is limiting the proliferation of drug discovery?
Right. So it's a very good question. It really is a multifactorial issue, and I think probably the biggest thing is the management of risk and the management of cost. And Tufts did a study a couple of years ago to show that the average drug is costing somewhere around $2.6 billion, takes 12 to 15 years to get through to the market, and has about a 93% failure rate. So when you have those kinds of costs and risks, it really drives up the end product costs and also the ability to have those drugs proliferated around the world, particularly to the underserved patients around the world. So we really think of this at Open Therapeutics as the siloization of knowledge. And when you create silos, by definition, you reduce proliferation. And it's this creation of silos, which really kind of began with the Bayh-Dole Act many years ago, but it was that creation, that enablement of the creation of silos that has really stopped this proliferation around the world.
Okay, great. Thank you. And
Right.
Jason, what is occurring globally that is limiting the R&D efforts of pharmaceutical companies?
Wow. Most pharma people that I know, the first thing they would say is, oh, patents. That's usually one of the first things that pops out, is that there aren't really strong patent protections in most of the jurisdictions around the world. We actually don't see it so much that as much as we see it breaking down the silos and enabling researchers around the world to collaborate. So as I mentioned earlier, when you have silos, by definition, you reduce proliferation. But if you can bring the labor force around the world to bear on these problems, it offsets some of the costs and it offsets some of the risks, and now you get some of the most highly trained and highly educated people in their societies to get involved in things, in drugs, that can have an absolute impact for their local economy and patient base. So we always like to say a Harvard PhD in Madagascar doesn't really get involved too much in the Western silo models, but in an open model, you're able to bring that particular researcher to bear. And as we know, there are really highly trained scientists around the world. In many parts of the world, their labor just is not called upon. And so they're out there trying to scratch their way through the scientific community, and they're unable to collaborate. So I think that, for me, the single biggest limiting factor in R&D is the enablement of the labor force around the world to participate and drive down risks and costs.
Right, and it's interesting you're using the term silo, because a lot of times we talk about silos, but they're usually internal silos. Like you have the quality function, the regulatory function, or R&D versus production. But the silos you're talking about are, a company keeps their knowledge to themselves, and they don't share it,
Yeah.
so no one can do it and create new products, new therapeutic areas, and things like that. Is that correct?
Yeah, and what's paradoxical to it is that the vast majority of the knowledge that occurs today in pharma is driven by really significant foundational knowledge that the public has paid for. So you end up seeing these rather significant amounts of what some people would call progress that are built and scaffolded upon pre-existing knowledge that the public has paid for. And so, we always like to quote that very famous scientist in 1676 who said, "If I see far into the future, it's because I stand on the shoulders of giants." And that was Sir Isaac Newton. And if Newton recognized in the late 1600s that science is an iterative process and that you're constantly building upon what everybody else is doing, it really creates this paradox where you now lock down the outcomes of this foundational science. So that's another significant limiting factor to R&D, is that we're not sharing as much knowledge as we probably could do. Now, there are a couple of pharma out there that are working on what they call open innovation models, and in those cases, they go to a university and they strike up a relationship with a professor, and they get the professor to do some work for them, and then they lock that down. So they're calling that an open innovation model. We think that's a little bit nebulous and maybe even a bit misleading in those cases. But it is apparently something that the pharma is starting to move toward, is starting to consider how they can become a little bit more transparent, particularly at the data front. As we all know, the lack of transparency in data is a really big problem in pharma.
Right, and I have a question to ask you about that, but I want to mention for those listening in, if you have any questions for Jason, we are going to have a Q&A session at the end, and you can open up your questions tab in your GoToWebinar panel and type in your question as he's speaking. It won't distract him. It comes directly to me. So please go ahead and ask your questions as the session is occurring. But Jason, I was going to ask you, I mean, you and I have been talking for years now, so I have a better understanding of this myself, but for those of you, those of people on the line who are just now learning about this for the first time, can you explain a little bit more about what you meant when you said the public is paying for this?
Right, so the taxpayer is already subsidized research done at universities, right? If they're a public university, tax dollars are supporting that work. They are also supporting it at the governmental level. So the National Institutes of Health develops a technology, and somebody comes in and licenses it, and they may do some further progress, and they lock it down. Well, the NIH is even doing that, right? They're even locking down intellectual properties because they believe they can't license it out unless there are patents in place for it. So the public's paying for it on two ends. They pay for it on the R&D front end, and then they pay for it again in the product pricing at the tail end of it. So we find that kind of strange, actually.
Yeah, and then they're paying for it in an indirect way as well, as far as the money that they're using to support this research might not benefit them in the end if it can't get into the right hands and people build on it, and it just gets shut down.
You're absolutely right, and of course, patient accessibility to medications that they've helped subsidize really is, I don't want to get into a political discussion necessarily, but I do find it sad that we have people in our society who help subsidize these things, and then at the end they don't get access to them. Right.
So then on this question, when we're talking about what is occurring globally, one of the challenges that you mentioned was the assurance of patent protection outside of the United States. Our laws don't apply across the world; they apply in the United States. So
yeah.
Is that basically what you're pointing out as far as what is limiting R&D efforts globally, is just not being sure that whatever they come up with can be patented?
Yeah, so a lot of pharma are very reticent to do so much economies of scale of their drugs because they're very concerned about patenting in those jurisdictions, China, India, that they're feeling they're going to have distribution issues with. And so it's fairly well known now that the Indian Supreme Court is really not supporting patenting these life-saving medications, and a couple of U.S. or international-based pharma, but headquartered in the U.S., have actually removed themselves from the Indian market because of the Indian government, mainly their Supreme Court, saying that some of these life-saving therapeutics can't be patented and locked down, which then opens up the generics market. So I find it kind of sad that they leave instead of trying to win with brand and quality and pricing like Bayer wins every day with aspirin in the marketplace. And so I know some would say, well, there's a big difference between the cost and investment in aspirin than there is in a cost and investment in an immunotherapy. And we actually don't see it that way, because if you open it up and you bring that global labor force to bear and you reduce those costs and risks, you now all of a sudden have a very different cost model, and the saturation model becomes one of economies of scale as opposed to one of limited, high-priced, and patented regions only.
Right. Okay, great, thank you. And building on what you were talking about as far as the public paying for research that's being done in universities or NIH or organizations like that, where a discovery was made, but yet then it has to be patented. And I believe then that the universities and NIH, their thought is, well, no one will buy it from us if it's not patented, because then they're almost instantly in the generics market right away. You wouldn't have the protection. So in your opinion, how can companies risk taking a product to market if its discovery was not patented?
Well, you know, in the Western pharma world where we fund things in a very dogmatic way, that is to say that it's the way it's always been done, therefore it's the way it's always going to be done. And we've seen this play out before in the operating system market of software, where Microsoft dominated the market for many years, and yet the product was fairly well disliked, both from a cost perspective but also from a quality perspective. And then along came this open source version called Linux, so that today 95%, even greater than 95% of the servers on the planet today run Linux. And Microsoft finally said, okay, we give up, we're going to adopt Linux. And so I think that a company that has a discovery and didn't patent it, you know, their primary concern is, well, if we didn't patent it, how are we going to raise capital for it? And I think that if they look at it from a market perspective and a labor perspective, they can actually crowdsource the scientific community around it, making it open, and win with quality, win with pricing, win with brand. And we think that at the end of the day, sooner or later, something is going to give in these developing economies, India, China, Africa, Latin America. Their GDPs cannot support healthcare expenditures the way our country is greatly struggling with it today. We used to talk about the military-industrial complex. Nobody talks about that anymore. Now it's the medical-industrial complex. And because of our healthcare model, and we have our own underserved patient populations in our own, but we're just barely getting by supporting our GDP with our healthcare expenditures. If you're in India, there's absolutely no way the Philippines or India or Malaysia or Indonesia that they can support the tremendous costs that come with locking down these pharmaceuticals, and you end up with these very polarized communities where you have very little proliferation of the drugs, therefore they have to be very high priced, as opposed to a broad distribution of drugs where the prices can be depressed under that economies of scale. So one of the things that I think companies can do to reduce their risk to getting the product to market is collaborating and bringing as many collaborators to the table as they can bring, and do that under a significant leadership paradigm where the value of the drug or the discovery is spread across the labor force around the world, as opposed to locked up in a single silo where you're not going to ever be able to feel comfortable marketing it because you didn't get patenting on it, and therefore you're really concerned about your cost model. So it's not an easy question to answer unless you're in my position, which is open it up, crowdsource the global scientific community, and offboard those risks and costs.
So let me ask you a question, because even though I've known you for years, and we've talked about this, you know, pretty much every time I see you, when you respond to some of these questions, even when we're just together talking, it takes me a while to process it because you're just so deep into this space. So let me see if I can kind of play back something. So, you know, historically, a company will patent what they've discovered because they need that patent protection in today's current models to recoup basically the money that they put into that, like I think you said, 12 to 15-year R&D cycle. So if you don't patent it and you don't have the patent protection, well, actually, okay, so I'm thinking through another thing as well. But if you don't have that patent protection, is your thought that, well, maybe your R&D costs aren't going to be as much because you're crowdsourcing the scientific input into your R&D space instead of your company having to come up with it all on their own? And then you could also reach a wider market if your product is cheaper. So maybe it's a higher volume. But
Absolutely.
But that would not come into play, obviously, if it's a rare disease kind of product and there's a limited population. But is that kind of what, how can the company raise enough money to cover their costs in an open model?
Yeah. So there's a lot there. First, rare diseases in the U.S. Don't necessarily equate to a small market around the world. So if you look at the global population, what we may define as a rare drug may actually be a very significant population. The second thing about opening this stuff up is that if you look at aspirin, and I love to call on the aspirin model because it's the most powerful drug ever created by humanity, there's now an indication for colorectal cancer for aspirin. You know, this was not done in a closed silo. This was some researchers that said, wow, I wonder if there can be an application here, and they went out and did it. Now, Bayer, of course, gets to go out and potentially market that indication. Now, they may not be able to do it in the U.S. under FDA aegis, but they may be able to go to Madagascar under Madagascarian law and do it there. So at the end, I think that it's about looking at the problem a little differently. And I call back to the software world, where when the Alice case went through, and this is really important, the Alice case said that basically you cannot patent software. And at the time, the venture community and software vendors, Microsoft included, jumped up and down and said, oh my God, if you can't patent software, it will destroy innovation. We'll never be able to bring products to market. We'll never be able to fund them. And that was the argument that was made. Today, we all know the proliferation of software has exploded proportionately to its openness. So you can go to the App Store at Google or Apple, and you have all of these applications now available to the marketplace built upon non-patented chassis. And who wins? The best one. And it's this tremendous proliferation that occurs that drives the price way down and increases the amount of availability for society. So you can get an iPhone anywhere in the world, and you can download applications anywhere in the world, and they're outside of the patenting realm, and anybody can go out and patent against it. And there's a lot of investment that goes into that. It's not like, you know, a 22-year-old sitting in a garage basement in Palo Alto hammering out some code. A lot of this stuff have big teams, very expensive teams, working on very significant things. And the barrier to entry is just that. Very significant teams, highly trained labor force, and they distribute that labor force around the world, and they get very robust products that have much lower cost, but it doesn't eliminate competition and let the best one win in the market. And so I think we've seen with Sequenom, Myriad, Mayo, those cases on the pharma side, I'm of the position that the pendulum is definitely swinging back toward a limitation on patenting of, quote, breakthrough discoveries based on pre-existing science, and that should interject competition into the market space. And whenever you have competition, most of us would agree that with competition gets wider distribution, economies of scale, lower prices, higher qualities. So that's a very big nut to crack there, Marla, but I think that's the way we got to see it. And by the way, it's not an either-or model. We think that there's still a place for these models to coexist. So Microsoft still has operating systems. Absolutely they do. And there is a place for those in the market. But at the same time, there's also a huge market for open source, and it's not going to go away either. So we think there's a place for both of these to coexist. And to that, I can see and envision large pharma actually collaborating with crowdsources on certain things that they have in their portfolio, particularly things they want to recycle or repurpose, where they can now get out with the scientific community, go to work on repurposing them, very low investment in them, and then win in the marketplace with brand and quality. And when I get very skeptical when I hear pharma say, well, we don't have to win with brand, and we don't have to win with quality, and we don't have to win with pricing, because I still think that those are very important market movers. So there's a lot of diatribe there, and I'm sorry for the long-winded offshoot.
No, it's fascinating, and I was laughing with Michelle, who's sitting next to me, because I just jotted down, is there a place for patents in this model? And he said, yeah, there is a place for them to coexist. But I was wondering, with that concept, do you see, for example, if a company has the open sourcing for discovery, that at some point along the way they patent their product, or that there's something about it that they do differently with it that they then patent, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have just a bottom perspective to this, what I call the least common denominator of patenting. I think that if the patent holder is willing to look at global distribution, they're willing to look at economies of scale, they're willing to look at quality that's not driven regulatorily, right? I mean, that's the big elephant in the room is in the U.S. in particular, and Europe is the regulatory environment. But if we were to just step back and look at it, does patenting help innovation or hinder innovation? And that, at the end of the day, is the question that has to be answered. And the dogma is, oh no, you can't patent, can't innovate. If you don't have a patent, you can't innovate. And what we've seen in multiple other venues is that actually not patenting stimulates competition and actually is very pro-patient. So I think the answer to the question is I don't have a crystal ball as to what should be patented or shouldn't be patented. What I think the response should be, if we're going to grant a patent, there are certain caveats that must be met in order for that patent to be issued. And we've seen this in the U.S. a couple of times, right, where people have said, wait a minute, you've got a patent from the U.S. government, and the U.S. government always reserves its right to have a non-exclusive license to that technology, or in times of war, an exclusive license to the technology. So the U.S. government could easily, under its legal framework, force pharma into a different way of doing their business model. So we'll see what happens on that front, but clearly healthcare, drug pricing is a very high priority in the U.S. and not so much in the rest of the world because they're just not getting access to the drugs to begin with.
Right. Okay, and kind of like on that note, I mean, the next question really, I know we've been talking about this all along, but so the question then is, how is open collaboration the answer for companies and for the hopes of patients around the world?
So, to be really honest about this, it really is a dichotomy between open and closed. And open, anytime you open something up, you bring a new, fresh set of eyes to the problem. And so when you're in a silo, two major things happen in the silo. The first one is you don't bring in collaboration. And the second thing is somebody else may be doing the same thing in another silo. So now you have the duplication of money going out, the duplication of effort, or triplification of effort. And so by opening it up and bringing this global labor force to bear, you off-board some of the risk, you off-board some of the risks and costs. And I'll give you a great example. An immunotherapy that we're actually opening up to the world for free. This particular immunotherapy has got great mouse model in vivo results, but nobody's done it in chinchillas yet. And now there's a small team in Sao Paulo that is looking to run, and they got extra chinchillas from a study that they ended up with extras out of, and they're going to actually do chinchilla studies on this with this immunotherapy, and then they'll publish on that, and that will inform other people about the in vivo results of that particular animal model. And so just by opening it up, you can bring excess personnel, you can bring excess lab equipment, you can bring excess consumables. You have the ability to crowdsource all these extra things that ordinarily might just go to waste. And so a company, by opening it up, can reduce their reliance on their own costs, and they reduce their reliance on their own teams by distributing it. Now, in the distribution of that knowledge, it's very important to set yourself as a leader. Leaders are the ones in the open community that are successful. And so if you open it up and you decide that, well, we're just going to open it up and we're going to walk away, well, it may never get traction. So you still have to go out and promote it and be actively involved in helping the community understand what it is they're working with.
Yeah, and this is very exciting and also a little bit daunting. There's so much information that would become available. How do you find that needle in the haystack of this study done in this area of the world actually relates to exactly what we're trying to do, and we've got a match. But it's exciting because how many of us know of someone who has an illness where it's terminal or very, very concerning, very serious, and it could be years before the cure is found, versus an open model that, like you pointed out, the I guess exponential growth in what can be done in the research area is exciting. I mean, it gives us more hope, I believe.
Yeah.
So very exciting.
So we're opening up an amphiphilic amine that comes out of the University of Bologna in Italy, the oldest university in the world, I might add. And the professor there has been working on this compound for many years. And she's near the, probably 90% of her career now is behind her. And instead of patenting it, locking it down, and maybe never having this thing see the light of day, she said, I really want to see this thing open, and I want to see more researchers working on it. And now we have a small team in Bangalore, and it's not even launched yet, but they caught wind of it, and they're already talking to 2 universities there about going in and doing lab work with excess materials to see if they can move this amphiphilic amine a little further along, generate publications, and of course Isabella gets co-authorship on that. So it's a way for her to proliferate science, which really at the end of the day, Marla, the vast majority of people that go into science, they go in for it to proliferate knowledge. They don't go into it to lock things down in patents. And so we really see this ability to unlock knowledge again in these underserved markets around the world and let them take care of themselves, so to speak.
Right, and I guess it's striking to me to know that I think when we were talking a couple years ago, you were saying anytime a university publishes their findings, all of a sudden nobody can touch it, and just how much information is just sitting there because it can't be patented because it's been published. So yeah.
So Dr. Tim Kripe at Nationwide Children's Hospital, this is a great example that you quote here, Marla. He developed this phenomenal viral oncolytic, but the place that he worked at before, the institution, decided for budgetary reasons to not patent on it. So he went ahead and published it, and now it's technically open, but nobody is able to promote it because it's a needle in the haystack. And he came to us, Dr. Kripe said, hey, I'd really like to see this thing get out into the world. And so now we become the promoting authority for it. And similar to the amphiphilic amine, there's a separate team in Bangalore who are now really working to get this thing up and running and then do the manufacturing of it in India. So really exciting development there, exactly of a needle in the haystack that didn't get patented, that otherwise would never have seen the light of day.
Yeah, that's very exciting. And I think for those who are on the line, you might be thinking, okay, I know looking back at my days in the pharma industry, back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when there was the boom of, everything we touched was golden and went to the market and was like the next big blockbuster drug. And we haven't really seen too many of those since then. And it's becoming much more personalized medicine and small markets, small patient categories. But so how much longer can our industry continue? And more importantly, how can we possibly meet the needs of so many patients who have these diseases that we've never heard of before? So for your company to think about, gosh, we could look through what's published and take it to market, and there's a model for it, I think it gives the industry some hope, which to me is then what gives the patients hope. So I think this is all very exciting, Jason.
Thank you, Marla.
Yeah, so we had a couple questions, and I know the person who asked them, and he had to drop off, I'm guessing, because we've gone beyond 12:30, so I'll circle back with him. But otherwise, we don't have questions at this point. So, Jason, I just thought I'd ask you then, is there anything else that you want to sum up with, or any parting words that you have for everyone?
Yeah, it would be I appreciate the offer to give a conclusion. I think one of the things that I would really like to end with is, often used but said and not often used, is that if we find a way to reach patients around the world, it can help change the paradigm of the way those people in those societies see America and the West. When you have a child that's dying from a waterborne disease and there's nothing available to help them, and you see all this tremendous wealth in these other areas, it's easy to become radicalized. And so one of the things that we should really focus on is not just the financial sides of the equation, but the social impacts of the equation and how we end up paying for these inequities in other ways. And so I really think that the pharma folks, if they could really think about the mutual bottom line, the social bottom line as well as the financial bottom line, can help turn the curve of folks out there that want to do damage to the United States because they've lost hope.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting too is obviously this industry is not a philanthropic industry, so they have to make money to stay in business. And I've also seen that in countries where they don't have the pricing models, patent protection, there is no R&D going on in those countries.
That's
so
right.
I think to do what you're proposing here is a real paradigm shift. And as you pointed out in the very beginning, there's so many other industries that had to go through that paradigm shift, as painful as it was, but look at the explosion of technology and innovation that has occurred as a result, and some very, very profitable companies as well. So there is a way to do it. We just have to think about how can we get on board with that for the companies themselves, but also for the patients around the world. So very exciting. So Jason, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I want to thank everyone online for joining us, and we will have a survey that goes out at the end of this that shares some of the initiatives we have going on, and just let us know if you'd like to be engaged, and we will be sure to reach back out to you and would love to include you. So thank you everyone for your time, and have a wonderful day. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, Marla.